Good morning. And a good Chodesh. I should have mentioned it yesterday too. Good Chodesh Cheshvan, Mar Cheshvan. Now let's continue. We covered in our overview of Chabad Chassidus, primarily Chabad Chassidus, spoke about the Baal Shem Tov, the Magid, briefly, the Alter Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe, and the Tzemach Tzedek. So we're up to the Rebbe Maharash. Obviously, I filled in as we went along some corrected dates, as well as additional books and svarim that they had published or include their teachings. So I want to just mention before I continue with the Rebbe Maharash, to go to the Tzemach Tzedek. I mentioned the one sefer I did not mention. It was Biuri HaZeyar. The Mittler Rebbe, as I pointed out, published a Biuri HaZeyar of all the Maimorim of his father, the Alter Rebbe, that he would say, especially Friday nights, in explaining the Zayar for a period of time. The Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe, wrote those Hanochas, wrote those transcripts, and then gathered them together and published them in a sefer called Biuri HaZeyar. Often referred to Biuri HaZeyar L'Admur Hamtsoi, even though it's the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe, but the Mittler Rebbe wrote them, and it was he that published it. The Tzemach Tzedek, in his classic style, wrote also Biuri HaZeyar, which is based often on those Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe written by the Mittler Rebbe, but in his own language, meaning not necessarily Hanochas, but further explanation, and plenty of pieces that are just standalone. And today we have 2 volumes of that, Biuri HaZeyar of the Tzemach Tzedek. And what distinguishes them is whether it's the Mittler Rebbe, Biuri HaZeyar, L'Admur Hamtsoi, or Tzemach Tzedek. So that's another part of the corpus of Chabad Chassidus literature that comes from the Tzemach Tzedek, and I think that covers it. The rest I already mentioned in the previous class. So with that, let's move now to the Rebbe Maharash. Rebbe Maharash is the 4th Chabad Rebbe, and in the scheme of Sfiris, the Baal Shem Tov and the Magid being Keser, Atik and Arich, and Alter Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek, Chochmah Bina Das, we know the Rabbeim say that the Rebbe Maharash is Netzach, with the Rebbe Rashab being Hoid, and then based on that, we figured that the Frierdiker Rebbe is Yesod, and the Rebbe is Malchus, the 7th of the Midrash. Why they skip Chesed Gvura Teferes, I don't think I've seen anywhere written. It's not a surprising thing per se, because very often Netzach Hoid Yesod are branches of Chesed Gvura Teferes. They're also right, left, center. However, that's the way it's established, and it's also coming from Sukkos in the Oshpizin, talking about the Chassidic Oshpizin, it's also categorized like that. The 7 Oshpizin. So you have the Oshpizin, of course, begins with the Baal Shem Tov and the Magid, the Alter Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek, and then the Rebbe Maharash, all the way to Malchus on Simchas Torah, the Rebbe Shmini Atzeres, the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Shiner Rebbe, the Rebbe Rashab, going backwards. Okay, the Rebbe Rashab was born in the year Tov Kuf Tzadik Daled. That's the equivalent of 1834. On Beis year.
You mean the Rebbe Maharash or the Rebbe Rashab?
Rebbe Maharash was born on Tov Kuf Tzadik Daled, which is 1834, Beis year. I may have inadvertently said the wrong name, and he passed away in Yud Gimel Tishrei, Tov Reish Mem Gimel, which is the equivalent of 1883. So he lived 48 years. I think it's the least, it's the least of all the Rabbeim in the years. 48 years. He was always not so well physically, but he became Rebbe in Tov Reish Chavav. Tov Reish Chavav is the equivalent of 1866. Became Rebbe after the passing of the Tzemach Tzedek. So though there were 7 brothers, there were different brothers. He was the youngest, named Rab Shmuel. But the Tzemach Tzedek specifically said that he should become the Mamal HaMokim. All his brothers were all great people, and sometimes even referred to as Rebbes, Admurim. But one went to Kopist, one went to Babres. They were different cities. But the Rebbe Maharash became the next Nasi of Chabad, And as I said, Tafresh Chavav, after the passing of the Tzemach Tzedek, on the date Yud Gimel Nisan, right before Pesach that year. So and from Tafresh Chavav on till Tafresh Mem Gimel, which is literally Chavav Lamed 10, 14, 17 years. So he delivered Maimorim. Now, what's unique with the Rebbe Maharash is all the three previous Rabbeim all have actual Sfarim in addition to the Maimorim that they delivered. Like we mentioned, Tanya, later Torah Likutei Torah, those are Maimorim. They're printed in books of Mitler Rebbe, of course, many books, Tzemach Tzedek as well. The Rebbe Maharash main output of Chassidus is Maimorim itself. They became Sfarim after he delivered the Maimorim. They were all written down, and then later years it was published into a series called Torah Shmuel, named after the Rebbe's name, the Rebbe Maharash's name. And you have basically Torah Shmuel, Sefer Maimorim, Tafresh Chavav, Tafresh Chav Zayin, Tafresh Chav Tes. So it's completely by the years. It was not turned into like a like Eira Torah, where it's by the parshas. So this begins a series by the years. So you have a mimer for every, basically almost, well, not every Shabbos, but every parsha and every holiday. That is the Rebbe Maharash. So what is the amount of material that we have? As I said, those 17 years, from Tafresh Chavav till Tafresh Mem Gimel. Again, the equivalent of being 1866 to till Tafresh Mem Gimel 1883, and it's 17 volumes, and we have them today. They actually were published. Many of them were published just recently. When I say recently, I mean the last 30 years, relative to the others that were published earlier. So today we have all of that. Now, the Rebbe Maharash, his main output, talking now content-wise, was a lot of it is, of course, taking the Tzemach Tzedek's Maimorim, his father's Maimorim, and either he rewrites them with some additions, or it's based on them. So the Rebbe Maharash is very much, you can see, an extension of the Tzemach Tzedek. And I say extension, not that he doesn't have original material, but he's developing the ideas that the Tzemach Tzedek laid out. Now, what's also unique about the Rebbe Maharash, so that's, as far as the evolution of Chassidus, the Rebbe Maharash looks, I mean, this is my own speculation. I've not seen it specifically written anywhere. But when you learn it, what you see is that he's beginning to take what the Alter Rebbe and the Mitler Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek, as I mentioned in the previous class, Tzemach Tzedek gathered them all together in a very organized and meticulous way. The Rebbe Maharash is beginning to develop the ideas now, so to speak, to the next generation and generations. More explanation, more in-depth analysis of different themes, whether it's Yesh, Ayin, and Yesh, or the Das Elyon and Das Tachten, many different ideas. Now, of course, there are a lot of original ideas. For example, there's a maimer called Mi Kamoicha Tafresh Chav Tes. Tafresh Chav Tes, the equivalent of 1869, where in this maimer, Mi Kamoicha, he talks about something that the Rebbe quotes often about existence. Is existence real? Or is it an illusion? And he brings proofs that it's real. So it's one of the Maimorim that you can say is attributed to Rebbe Maharash. You don't find it earlier in Maimorim. But as I said, I'm not going to go through all the Chidushim of all the Rabbeim. Just wanted to point out part of the uniqueness of what the Rebbe Maharash is contributing. Another thing that is worthy mentioning is that Rebbe Maharash was machadish the concept of a Hemshech. Now we know we've learned the Hemshech. The longest Hemshech and biggest one of them all is Ayin Beis. Why is it called a Hemshech? A Hemshech means a series. It's no longer a single mimer, it's a series of Maimorim. Now how long is the series? Could be 5. There are Hemshechim, there are 3 Maimorim. Those are 5. There's 10, 20, 30. And then there's the 61 of Samach Vav and the 144 of Ayin Beis. Those are the longest. But who innovated the idea of a Hemshech is the Rebbe Maharash. So we have from the Rebbe Maharash several Hemshechim. I'll mention them. In order, I'll try to mention them in order. I think the first Hemshech is Mayim Rabim Tafresh Lamed Vav. very interesting, connected to this week's Parsha, Mayim Rabim. It's a Hemshech that goes, I think it's something like 40 or 50 Maimorim. I may be wrong in the exact number, but it's one volume, but it's a Hemshech, meaning he delivered them actually week by week, but every week was a continuation of what we learned and what we discussed, not what we learned, what was said last week. Like we learned, see, each Maimer begins, Yesh Lahagdim, before, ask some questions on the beginning of the verse that he'll quote, and said, in order to understand it, let's preface what we learned earlier, or what was explained earlier. So that would constitute a Hemshech, and it would go, and like in the case of Mayim Rabim. The next big Hemshech, which is very considered one of the fundamental Hemshechim, is Hemshech V'kocha Tofreis Lamed Zayin. A year afterwards, Pesach, the Rebbe Maharash began another Hemshech called V'kocha. And there's also themes that are very unique to that Hemshech. Always, as I've pointed out, they're always based on the Chassidus that came before them. But the elaboration and sometimes concepts that were very briefly mentioned here developed in a very comprehensive way. So V'kocha Tofreis Lamed Zayin, also a similar size to Mayim Rabim, something like 40, 50 Maimorim. And then there's a few shorter Hemshechim, Matzah Zu, Zeis Chanukas HaMizbeach, Yeinosi. They were published in separate books. They're also Hemshechim. They're in the years more Tofresh Mem and Mem Aleph. Again, that would be 1880, 1881. And of course, Tofresh Mem Gimel would be the last year of the Maimarim, the last Maimer being said before Yud Gimel Tishrei of that year, when there was the Histalkus, the Elula of the Rebbe Maharash. So that is more or less the Rebbe Maharash's output. In addition, we also have letters from the Rebbe Maharash. Like I said, all the Rebbeim had correspondence with different activists, Chassidim, or in general, different letters that they wrote to various people who wrote to them, correspondence. So we have Igres from the Rebbe Maharash. What else do we have from the Rebbe Maharash? We do have some psukim, some halachic rulings that he gave, not as many as that we have from the Tzemach Tzedek, for example. Then we have another interesting thing, even though it's a biography, but it's the Rebbe that wrote it. I mentioned there's biographies of all the Rabbeim, but they were not written by the Rabbeim. They were written by Chassidim who gathered together everything from different places. In this case, the Rebbe Maharash, there's a Sefer HaTeldos Admur Maharash that the Rebbe himself composed, and there he brings the biography, the history, stories, and different various elements from the Rebbe Maharash. Chassidim have always wondered why the Rebbe, of all the Rabbeim, wrote that biography. There are different theories on this. I don't know if here's the place to go into them. There's no question there was a special affinity that the Rebbe had with the Rebbe Maharash, like with all the Rabbeim, but especially Rebbe Maharash, lechatchila riber. As we know, the expression from the Rebbe Maharash became, for the Rebbe, the theme that personified the Rebbe Maharash, that he did everything lechatchila riber in a very breite, very expansive way. And not, again, here's not necessarily the place to explain why that particular connection, but that covers the Rebbe Maharash. I should add something which I did not mention. I'll mention it now. All the Rabbeim also, we have from them sayings, expressions, like sometimes at a meal, or in person to a chassid, or to their children, they said things. And that was, they're not collected in any particular book, but you find them found in many of the Frierdiker Rebbe's talks, where he, and we'll soon talk about the Frierdiker Rebbe when we get there, that you'll find that he quotes that the Rebbe Maharash said this, like this expression I just said, L'chatchila Rebbe. You're not going to find it in a mimer. So where does it come from? So the Frierdiker Rebbe had in a letter says, my grandfather would say, and he says the statement that the world says that if you can't go under, you go over. And I say, L'chatchila Rebbe, you go initially from above. Many, many expressions are taken often from the letters of the Frierdiker Rebbe, from the Rebbe. Some of them the Rebbe gathered in Hayom Yom, which we'll talk about later when we talk about the Rebbe. So there's another element of output from the Rabbeim, which I did not mention till now, and those are sayings. And that can be gathered, that's gathered in some of their biographies. No one ever gathered that. It could be, I may be mistaken, there may be a sefer where a chassid, maybe one of the contemporary writers, authors, maybe made a compendium of all the sayings from the Rabbeim that are not published in any one particular place. I just wanted to add that. One more thing that is also worthwhile mentioning, that the Rabbeim also composed songs, nigunim. So even though it's not necessarily the literature of Chabad Chassidus, but it's definitely an output of Chabad Chassidus. You know, the Alter Rebbe composed 10 nigunim. The other Rebbeim may not have composed them, but there were nigunim that were sung before them. Like, for example, the Mittler Rebbe had a kapella, a choir. So we have a song attributed to that choir. So not necessarily composed by the Rebbe, but it was a very, we call it a favorite nigun by the Rebbe. Then the Tzemach Tzedek, Yemin Hashem, and other songs attributed. Sometimes composed by them, sometimes they asked it to be sung, often being a song that in some way captured something that they wanted to convey. From the Rebbe Maharash, we sing the nigun Chabad Rebbe, but I don't know if it was composed by the Rebbe Maharash or not. I would have to look it up. There is a sefer called Sefer HaNigunim, which compiles all the Niguni Chabad, and there's history about each song. But I just wanted to add that as well. That's another so-called output. Okay. With that, before I go to the Rebbe Rashab, let me stop if there are any questions. I think I covered Rebbe Maharash. I'm thinking, is there something that he put out that I did not mention? I think that's it. Are there any questions?
Yes, I have a question. You mentioned that Rebbe Maharash made Maimorim Das Elyon, Das Tachten. Yes. Is that Maimorim a big one or a small one?
About that particular topic?
No, you said that, as I understood, the separate Maimorim that Rebbe Maharash.
Every week, just like all the Rebbes, he said a mimer almost every Shabbos and every holiday, and they were gathered together by the years.
Yes, you said that the name, or maybe I'm wrong. I misunderstood.
I didn't say I said there were Hemshechim. There were series of Maimorim that have a name, like Mayim Rabim V'Kocha, Matzazu Yoinosi, Seis Chanukah Samizbeach.
There is no such Maimorim specifically about Das Elyon, Das Tachten.
No, within these Maimorim, he talks about that.
So there is no separate, just as a
right.
part that I would like to learn, for example.
No, you can take an index and look up that topic, and then find which discourses he discusses it in.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
I had a question briefly, and I think it came up once before in just general kibitzing or talking about Rebbeim during learning over the past several years. But since we're here, I have heard maybe more than once suggestion that beyond the Rebbe Maharash not being medically, physically well many years in his life, but that toward a certain point toward the end of his life, I'm not sure, but that he was maybe not like 100% psychologically, or that he suffered from depression. I don't remember I don't remember what I heard, and I certainly don't want to speak Lashon Hara, but can you speak to that? And it's sort of as an adjunct to that, sort of a corollary.
I've never heard that before.
You've never heard that before?
But the Rebbe Maharash?
Yeah.
No.
Huh. Okay. Well, the corollary question was, yes, I mean, he's written some amazing Maimarim, and some of them are, I would say, very, deep in terms of spiritual metaphysics, if you will. But in some sense, like perhaps he had almost like too much Ruach HaKodesh. It's like
where do you see that? What are you basing this on?
I'm sorry, my memory's not good, but of the Maimarim I've read, when I've read him, he seems not only lucid and coherent, but brilliantly insightful in his understanding of Elokus and all the different worlds. And
but all the Rabbeim, that's what the Rabbeim stood out for. They all were.
I understand. That goes without saying. That's why I'm asking about him in particular. On the one hand, you have well, again, this.
I'm not clear what you're. Go
Okay,
ahead.
I'm just
I
telling you what
never
I've
heard
heard.
any of this. Rebbe Maharash, I mean, his stuff is brilliant, but so is the Rebbe Rashab, and so is the Tzemach Tzedek. I mean,
Well, I wasn't trying to
nothing.
suggest his Chassidus was more special than any other of the Rebbeim, but that it had a unique quality of being slightly more ethereal, if one can be more ethereal. I mean,
I never heard that either. I'm not sure where you got that from. I've learned the Rebbe Maharash as old as my Marim.
huh.
I'm not.
Well, you're
I
the
wouldn't.
expert, so let me just
No,
while you're
unless you saw it somewhere or someone told you. I I would I wouldn't say anything like that.
um
It's not the way I would describe it.
okay,
Did you hear
well,
that from someone or did you
yeah,
read it somewhere?
that's what I'm checking now.
Okay. Anyway, if you find something, let me know because I'm not aware of any such comment that anyone ever made about the Rebbe Maharash. Each one has their unique approach. They're all ethereal. They're all Chassidus Chabad. I mean, some are. It's very hard to. We don't talk about the Rabbeim in this context at all. You could talk about Chachma and being the Alter Rebbe's Maimorim are shorter relative to the Mittler Rebbe's Maimorim. It's some Chassidic grounds everything in sources, but those are very documented things that you could see. It's not theory. It's not analysis. You see their styles, and so I shared what I know about the Rebbe Maharash, and the Rebbe Maharash is a critical piece in the evolution of Chassidus Chabad. If you want to learn Chassidus properly, you go from the Alter Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek, Rebbe Maharash, and now we're going to get to the Rebbe Rashab.
Uh-huh.
Okay? So, as I said before, the Rebbe Maharash serves, if I were to quantify it, it would be more like taking the Chassidus of the Alter Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek, like if you want the three Rishonim, and starting to bring it down in a way, the language begins to become more explanatory, even more than they did. And Rebbe Rashab will take it to another level, as we'll discuss now. But the Rebbe Maharash, you could start seeing the beginnings of the Rebbe Rashab's approach in the Rebbe Maharash's approach. And that's that. So let's move now to the Rebbe Rashab, unless anyone else has any questions. Okay. So, fifth Chabad Rebbe, Rebbe Rashab. Rebbe Rashab is born in Tov Reish Chaf Aleph, Chaf Cheshvan. A few weeks from now, Tov Reish Chaf Aleph. So Tov Reish Chaf Aleph would be 1860, because it was still not the change of the secular year. So 1860, Chaf Cheshvan, and he would be a Rebbe. He would live until Beis Nissen, Tov Reish Pei. Tov Reish Pei is the equivalent of 1920. So he moves as a transition from the 19th century to the 20th century. And he becomes a Rebbe pretty early, the youngest, I believe. He becomes a Rebbe in Tov Reish Mem Gimel when his father, the Rebbe Maharash, passes away. He becomes a Rebbe, Tov Reish Mem Gimel, 1883. Or 1882, I should say, because it's Yud Gimel Tishrei. And though he was not the oldest son was Rabbi Zalman Aaron, known as the Razah, but nevertheless, he was very clear that he would be the Rebbe. Razah didn't want to be the Rebbe, and Rebbe Rashab was. So how old is he? Chaf Aleph to Mem Gimel. He's literally 22 years old. 22 years old. When you count, let's say, Chaf Cheshvan to, what did I say, Yud Gimel Tishrei. 22 years old, very young. Now, formally, the Rebbe Rashab did not want to be called Rebbe for 10 years. So though he said Maimorim, and people came to him for Yechidus, personal audiences, but he refused to be seen formally as a Rebbe. Some say the reason was because till the Razah moved away, or maybe, I'm not sure when the Razah passed away, but some say that's the reason. I don't know if it's very clear why, but Tov Reish Nun Gimel was when he became formally, to the point, I'll just tell an amusing story, that when they called him up to the Torah, so until someone's a Rebbe, you don't call him by the name Adonai Mareinu V'Rabbeinu. You say his name and his father's name. But the Rebbe Rashab insisted that he be called up to the Torah even after the Rebbe Maharash passed away, by his name, not by the words Adenenu Mereinu Rabbeinu. Some of the Chassidim were very adamant and wanted him to be called a Rebbe. So they went to the Gabbai of the shul in Lubavitch, and one of them said to him, "I'll give you 1,000 ruble. It's like $1,000, 1,000 ruble. Next time you call up the Rebbe to the Torah, say Kvedushas Yamoid, Kvedushas Adenenu Mereinu Rabbeinu, Ben Rab Shmuel," however the expression would have been. And he said to him, if you don't do it, we'll give you a mashkanta, we'll give you a few patch. I mean, you won't beat him up, but they'll make him uncomfortable. Anyway, he wasn't the wisest person on earth. So in his innocence, he went to ask the Rebbe Rashab what to do. So he goes to the Rebbe Rashab and says he was offered 1,000 ruble to call the Rebbe up by the name Rebbe, and he was told that if he doesn't do it, they're going to make his life a little uncomfortable. So the Rebbe Rashab said to him, "I'll give you 1,000 ruble if you don't call me up this way, and Petch, you deserve anyway." Because obviously it's a little ridiculous for him to go ask the Rebbe such a question. But anyway, just as an aside, it's not relevant to the theme of what I want to discuss, but it just came to mind. Rebbe Rashab, of course, was very humble and was very anonymous, not in Lubavitch, but he would travel. He would travel especially to Europe, and generally try to keep his identity private. A lot of stories about that, but let me go to the main point here. So the Rebbe Rashab, his output, like the Rebbe Maharash, is all through Maimorim. All the Sfarim are basically Sifrei Maimorim of the Rebbe Rashab. Some of them are Hemshechim, like we mentioned. I'll mention them as we go. And but Maimorim. So he began saying Maimorim. This first Maimor Keser Yitnu Tafresh Mem Gimel. So we have a Seif Maimorim Tafresh Mem Gimel, Seif Maimorim Tafresh Mem Dal. Mem Gimel, Mem Dal go together. Earlier years, some of them were lesser Maimorim were said. Mem Hey, Mem Vav, Mem Zayin, and so on, all the way till Tafresh Pei. So literally every year we have Maimorim, and here again, like the Rebbe Maharash and like the Rabbeim before, he delivered the Maimorim and he wrote most of them. There are a few he did not write, or we don't have the manuscript, but he wrote most of them, and that's what we have. So when you look at these Sifrei Maimorim, you'll see all the discourses that he delivered with their dates, and in some places, the back of the book will be the Hanochas that others wrote. So even though there was Hanocha written with the Rebbe Rashab, you'll have two versions. And then there are Maimorim that we only have Hanochas, meaning only written by others. We don't have the Rebbe Rashab's original Maimor. There are some Maimorim that you'll find that he didn't finish writing. There are a few like that, where it says At Kan, that he gave us the manuscript. Either he didn't have time finishing it. That's in most cases. Maybe in a few cases, maybe something got lost. I don't think that's the case. But generally speaking, that's the output. So we're talking about many years. Mem Gimel to Nun Gimel to Samach Gimel, Ayin Gimel. Talking about 47 years. So it's at least, it's not 47 volumes because a few of them are combined. That's what we have. But I should qualify that we don't only have Maimorim, we also have Kuntresim. The Rebbe Rashab did something, again, unique. He gave out certain kuntresim. A kuntras means more like a journal or a publication, not a full sefer. He called it kuntras. And here are the names of the kuntresim that he gave out. He gave out a sefer called Kuntras HaTfilah, a kuntras on prayer, kuntras HaAveda, a kuntras on Aveda serving Hashem, kuntras Eitz HaChaim, which is essentially laying out the purpose of establishing the yeshiva, Tenchet Mimim and Tafresh Nun Zayin, which would be the equivalent of 1897, that he gave out. He established the yeshiva and wrote a whole essay. You can call them essays, actually, these kuntresim. That may be a good word for them. They're essays. These were not delivered, even though there are themes in these kuntresim that were said in Maimorim, in different respective Maimorim, but these were written originally by the Rebbe Rashab as a kuntrus. And then there's a kuntrus Chanoich Lenar, yet another kuntrus. It's also connected to somewhat being like a tzavah, something like a last will and testament, where he includes instructions to his son, the Frierdiker Rebbe, about going forward. But it's a kuntrus as well, a kuntrus that we learn. So those are the kuntresim. There's one more kuntrus, kuntrus Umayon, maybe the most famous of them all, kuntrus Umayon. This is like a mimer on the pasuk Mayim Beis Hashem, but he called it kuntrus Umayon. And these are, generally speaking, much longer than an individual mimer. They're with chapters, with summaries. Most of them are 50 pages, around 50, 60 pages each. So these are the kuntresim that the Rebbe Rashab published. This is in addition to the Maimorim. Okay. We'll still talk about the approach, his methodology, but also the Rebbe Rashab, like all the Rabbeim, also farbrengt. He gave sichas. But with the other Rabbeim, we don't have a lot. We have some, and they were compiled recently into books called Sefer HaSichas of the Tzemach Tzedek, Rebbe Maharash less. But the Rebbe Rashab, we have a sefer called Torah Shalom. Torah Shalom is a book, very powerful, and we actually learned part of it at the end of Ayin Beis, you may recall, where these are the talks that he delivered, not Maimorim, like the talks, especially Yutas Kislev and Simchas Torah and Purim. Those are most of the talks that we have in there. But it's very much off the record type of material, like very informal. In a mimer, everything is said very formally, certain type of language. In Torah Shalom, the Rebbe Rashab speaks almost laid back and informally. So it's very rich in giving a lot of between the lines that you won't find in a mimer. So Torah Shalom is a must read, anyone who really learns Chassidus, because you see things there you won't find. He'll talk about Atzmos and talk about Oyer and things in his own unique language, like I said, informally, as if you're having a conversation with him. In contrast to a mimer, which is a very formal discourse, and here's the text with all the explanations and so on. So Torah Shalom is a slim volume. It's around 200 pages, 250 pages of sichas dated over the years. The sichas that were written, some of them were written by the Frierdiker Rebbe, Hanochas by the Frierdiker Rebbe, and some were written by other Chassidim, and very, very powerful stuff. I've taught a few of those sichas over the years. There's one sicha actually he talks about sexuality, if you can call it intimacy and Chassidus. Very fascinating talk that he gave on Yutas Kislev about how Chassidus is a way of bringing healthy intimacy in a person's life. It's on YouTube. I did a 2-part class on that a number of years ago, quite a few years ago, honestly. And then there's some others that I have taught over the years, but bottom line, that's Torah Shalom. So that's the output of the Rebbe Rashab. Let me see if there's some. Then there's the letters. Igros Kodesh is more, now we have a lot more correspondence than from previous Rebbes. So it's several volumes. I believe we have 7 or even 8 volumes, 8 or 9 maybe, 8 volumes for sure, of the Rebbe Rashab's correspondence. Either because he wrote more or because it's closer to us, so we have more material that remained. The others may have been lost. Not really sure why, whether he wrote more or, as I said, we have retained more. But he definitely has volumes of correspondence, which include also topics of Chassidus, plus other Askanas Tziburis, public affairs dealing with the Jewish people, Eretz Yisrael, Chevron, and so on and so forth. That's the Rebbe Rashab. Now, as far as the actual methodology of the Rebbe Rashab, so here, you've heard a lot from me about this because we learned Ayin Beis. As we learned Ayin Beis, we learned exactly that was the method of the Rebbe Rashab. That is definitely unique compared to the previous Rabbeim. So the best way to capture it is how the Frierdiker Rebbe says that Chassidim said that the Rebbe Rashab was the Rambam of Chassidus. The Rambam of Chassidus. And he explains why. Because like the Rambam, he took all of Torah Shebiksav, all of Torah Shebal Peh up to his time. And like he writes in his introduction to Mishnah Torah, to Yad HaChazakah, he collected it all in a Masudadik, in an organized way, halachas. So for example, the laws of Shabbos. So even though in the Gemara there's a Masechta Shabbos, but we know Masechta Shabbos, number one, there are many things that not about Shabbos in Masechta Shabbos, because the Talmud is written more like a dialogue an informal dialogue of the students as they were learning in the Beis Medrash of the Tanoim and Amoraim, as they were teaching and discussing. So they moved from Shabbos to Yom Kippur to Eruvin to Tumah V'Tara. So even though in general it's Masechta Shabbos, the Rambam took only the halachas out from Masechta Shabbos and anything else in other Masechtas and Shas that belong to Shabbos and put them in the Hilchas Shabbos. Same thing Hilchas Yontif, Hilchas Yisei De'atera. And he broke it into all these halachas that we have. Hilchas Beis Abchira, Hilchas Eidus, Hilchas Sheftim. So similarly, the Rebbe Rashab took all the sugyas of Chassidus and organized them in a very sugya type of way, like the Rambam. So it's very all-encompassing, now very different than the Tzemach Tzedek. Tzemach Tzedek, first of all, did it for the first 3 generations. And secondly, Tzemach Tzedek did it more in an organized way, but you don't really have the sugyas quite like the Rebbe Rashab really goes for pages upon pages. Like we see, Ayin Beis, to me, captures the Rambam more than any other part of the Rebbe Rashab's Maimorim, because there he did exactly that. He took all of Chassidus and put it into one long Hemshech, and it's all one flow. All the different sugyas, all connected obviously to Ardus Hashem and the Mamutza, the interface, and so on. So the Rebbe Rashab really, I would say, takes Chassidus that was there till then, meaning the Alter Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek, and his father, the Rebbe Maharash, and turns it into a really, really comprehensive study that anyone that studies the Rebbe Rashab really will get a real picture of Chassidus Chabad. Can you get it from the earlier? Of course you can. The Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe were able to see it in the Alter Rebbe, but not quite as once you see the Rebbe Rashab. And it's always been a question, if the Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe saw the Rebbe Rashab's Maimorim, how would they look at it? So it's similar to how the Amar Tanoim of the Mishnah would look at the Gemara. Obviously they see that everything was taken from the Mishnah, but they would be very impressed with how it was developed and broken down. And there are many things that were not spelled out exactly in the Mishnah, as we actually discussed in Ayin Beis, what the Gemara Talmud adds to Mishnah. So the Rebbe Rashab did that. The Rebbe once used an expression. The Rebbe once said, "You can't understand Chassidus without the Rebbe Rashab." And the truth is, when you learn, you could see why. If you want to really understand, let's say, Tzimtzum, or the Kav, or many other topics, Yichud Elah, Yichud Tata. So you can learn the Alter Rebbe's Maimorim, and you'll get an idea of what Tzimtzum is. But you're not going to get it with all the explanations and all the examples that the Rebbe Rashab develops. Like, for example, in the volume 2 in Ayin Beis, where he asked the question, how can a post-Tzimtzum reality connect and unite with a pre-Tzimtzum consciousness? A very big theme in Ayin Beis. The Alter Rebbe, once you see the Rebbe Rashab explain it, you can trace it back to the Alter Rebbe. But if you learned in the Alter Rebbe, you wouldn't quite have the full answer. Or even the Hamagbir L'Shevas that we learned. We know what we learned in Torah a few pages. And then the Mittler Rebbe's elaboration. But with the Rebbe Rashab, he takes it to a whole other level in explaining the whole scope of Yichud Tata and Yichud Elah and the Yichud that unites both Yichudim, where in the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe's Maimah, they talk about it, but much more briefly and much more cryptically. And the Rebbe Rashab develops it far, far more than that. And we actually, especially in my essay, I demonstrated what did the Rebbe Rashab add to the discussion before. So I don't want to go into, again, detailed subject matter here. Just wanted to say it in general terms, that the Rebbe Rashab takes it all and presents it very much more in a way that, in a contemporary way. Now you still need a teacher, and it's quite deep, the Rebbe Rashab. It's not like anyone can just read it, and it's easier to read than the Alter Rebbe's Maimorim. But when you do know how to read it, you definitely see an elaboration you will not find. Let's just take the very theme of Keser. The Alter Rebbe, of course, talks about Keser as a mamutza, interface. It's actually the Arizal that says that. But by them, it's much shorter. The Rebbe Rashab wrote a whole Hemshech Ayin Beis on that. The 3 levels of Keser and so on. So in the Tzemach Tzedek, for example, you'll find the 3 levels of Keser. You won't find it earlier, maybe only very, very briefly, but the Rebbe Rashab elaborates, again, about the 3 levels of Keser in a way that you will not find in the previous Maimorim. Now, some of it, a lot of it even, some of it is based on the Rebbe Maharash, like in Hemshech V'Kocha, the Rebbe Maharash does that, but not to the extent as the Rebbe Rashab did it, and not as many topics as the Rebbe Rashab did. The Rebbe Rashab covered virtually every Chassidic topic possible in this fashion. So that is an overview of the Rebbe Rashab and his output and his methodology, which then leads us, of course, to the next Frierdiker Rebbe, which I'll get to either in the next, but I'll stop here if anybody wants to ask anything. Oh, as far as the Hemshechim go, the Rebbe Rashab, of course, also wrote Hemshechim. The two big ones is Hemshech Samach Vav, which we intend to learn, and Hemshech Ayin Beis, which we learned. As I said earlier, 61 Maimorim and 144 respectively. Let me just confirm that. I have Samach Vav sitting here. Yeah, 61 and 144. So, but there are also other Hemshechim from the Rebbe Rashab, much smaller ones, not that length, not that many discourses, but even in the earlier years, you have a few that are 5 Maimorim, 6 Maimorim, 3 Maimorim. The ones that come to mind, other Hemshechim that jump out at us, those are the two big ones, let me think. The rest is, I mean, when you see it in this form, you'll see in the Mafteach, in the beginning, the table of contents, it'll say Aleph Beis Gimel Daled, meaning that these are 4 Maimorim in a series. There are a few of them in the earlier years. But nothing. And the Tafresh Nun is a pretty long one. Kol Hanena Nun Beis is not short. Samach to Samach. These are Maimorim that he said over a period of time. Interestingly, many of them around Simchas, like Samach to Samach Tafresh Nun Zayin, was said by the Frierdiker Rebbe's wedding. Tfilin Demara Alma Tafresh Nun Beis was said by the Frierdiker Rebbe's bar mitzvah. So you have certain occasions where he said a series of Maimorim, but they're shorter Hemshechim, and they often receive the name like Samach to Samach, Tafresh Nun Zayin, or Kol Hanena, Tafresh Nun Beis, Tfilin Demara Alma, Tafresh Nun Beis, or is that Nun Gimel? Nun Gimel, sorry, Nun Gimel. And a few others of that nature. But I think that covers it more or less. There's also, as I mentioned, the Igres, the letters, the Sichos we mentioned, and of course sayings, which are scattered in different places. And the Nigunim, there are Nigunim that are attributed to the Rebbe Rashab, or at least ones that he had them sing. And when we sing all the Rabbeinu's Nigunim, there's a Nigun that we always sing called the Nigun Rostov, or the Nigun Hachana, that is attributed to the Rebbe Rashab. I don't know if he composed it, I think not, but he was definitely one of his special favorites. So let's stop here. Any questions about the Rebbe Rashab? All clear? Okay, good. So that said, we have a few minutes here. Should I begin the Frierdiker Rebbe? Yeah, why not? Let's do the Frierdiker Rebbe. And then we'll have the Rebbe. Okay, so next generation. Next generation is the 6th generation of Chabad, Chassidus, Chabad Rebbeim. Frierdiker Rebbe, the only child and son of the Rebbe Rashab, born in Tafresh Mem. He was born in 1880. And he passed away 70 years later, Tafshin Yud, 1950. Becomes a Rebbe in 1920 when the Rebbe Rashab passing on Beis Nissen. So he's basically a Rebbe from 1920 to 1950, 30 years, 3 decades. And Frierdiker Rebbe, of course, stands out. Number one, he's the first Rebbe that really had to deal with. I mean, the Rebbe Rashab had to run away from Lubavitch because of World War I to Rostov. But the Frierdiker Rebbe gets arrested in 1927, leaves Russia, leaves Soviet Union in 1928, ends up in Poland, in Riga, Latvia, and then in 1940 comes to the United States. So the Rebbe has actually a few sichos where he describes the 3 decades of the Frierdiker Rebbe, where the first decade was in the Soviet Union, mostly, not mamish the full, but most of it. The second decade was in Europe, and the third decade in the United States. And he talks about the differences of these three periods, these eras. Very historic, obviously, because this is the real transition and upheavals that mirror and reflect what was going on with the Jewish people. The whole uprooting of Jewish life in Eastern Europe and Europe in general, and then coming to America. So the Frierdiker Rebbe was dealing with all the Rabbeim had difficult ordeals, and they were dealing with non-friendly governments. But the Frierdiker Rebbe was a whole different level. And yet, at the same time, he maintained his output of Chassidus, which I'm going to lay out right now. So he said Maimorim right away from the beginning. As a matter of fact, we have a sefer called the Chabad Rebbe, which I've mentioned, that describes Rabbi Moshe Berel Rifkin wrote like a diary of the events that happened in the last days of the Rebbe Rashab's life, but also the beginning of the leadership of the Frierdiker Rebbe, where the Frierdiker Rebbe calls him in and says the first mimer to him. He says, my father told me I should say Chassidus, so I have to listen to him, but I don't want to say before Chassidim, so I say it to you, to fulfill my father's last wishes. Rabbi Berel Rifkin opened the door so other Chassidim could hear the mimer standing outside in the hall. So that was the first mimer, Reishis Goyim Amolek, which was the last mimer of the Rebbe Rashab. Interestingly, the same thing happened with the Rebbe Maharash and the Rebbe Rashab, that the last mimer of the Rebbe Maharash was Keser, Yitnu Lecha. Remember, Yud Gimel Tishrei was his istalkus, so Keser was like a Yom Tov a theme. And the Rebbe Rashab begins his first mimer, Keser Yitnu Lecha. The same thing, the Frierdiker Rebbe, Reishis Goyim Amolek, from the last mimer around Purim time, before Beis Nissen, the Rebbe Rashab, and the first mimer of the Rebbe Frierdiker Rebbe is Reishis Goyim Amolek. Same thing, of course, would be the Frierdiker Rebbe and the Rebbe, Basiligani. We'll talk about that later. So the first mimer is Reishis Goyim Amolek, Tofresh Pei, 1920, said in Leningrad. Rostov. He wasn't yet in Leningrad. Rostov. A few years later, he would move to Leningrad, which became later Petersburg, renamed its original name to Petersburg. And with this begins the Sifrei Maimorim of the Frierdiker Rebbe. So you have a Sefer Maimorim, Tofresh Pei, Pei Aleph, Pei Beis. Some of them are combined because there were less Maimorim. And so goes. And here again, the Frierdiker Rebbe delivered these Maimorim, and he wrote most of them. 99% are written by the Frierdiker Rebbe. There are some he did not write, but the Frierdiker Rebbe, actually, I think almost all were written by him. And we have them all. And they were published. They were published through, especially in the later years. Some of them were published even in the time of the Frierdiker Rebbe, the actual Maimorim, what would be called, and actually I should say this was also true with the Rebbe Rashab, it was called Kupir. In Yiddish, Kupir is like a copy. It wasn't a formal printing. In those days, there were stencils. Like, with this type of stencils, they would put them in like carbon copies. That they would put it with blue ink on a stencil, and they would print it out. These were called kopir. They were usually typewritten, meaning they were type. The type was typewritten. It wasn't like we have today, the letters that are designed for a book. They were typewriter language. The Courier, I think, is the name of the font. And they were published and were distributed among Chassidim. Later, some people bound them together into books. This, by the way, the Rebbe Rashab as well. And I should mention, I didn't mention this before, that often what happened then, because there wasn't really a lot of printing and no technology, so even a few of them came out in typewritten, many of them were handwritten. And Bochum would actually sit. Even in my day, it was a little extent to that. They would actually sit and rewrite in their own handwriting a copy of a mimer that they got from someone. Because it wasn't really, publishing wasn't that prevalent. And there was some things printed and published, but it wasn't so, not in my days, of course, there was publishing. But still, there were Maimorim that people received from hand by hand, from person to person, and we rewrote them. Later, everything would be typed, and later everything would be typeset as things became more available. So the Frierdiker Rebbe, there's a lot of such Maimorim, and then they were put together in books, sometimes informally, where a Bocher, a student in yeshiva, or a Chassid would take a bunch of these kupir, so a bunch of these individual handwritten or even typed, and put them in a book and just bind them and maybe make 5 of them or 10 of them and sell them to friends or distribute them. But later, as the years came, the Rebbe started publishing them all. So today we have the Sifrei Mamorim of the Frierdiker Rebbe. From all these years, Tafresh Pei, all the way to Tafshin Yud, 1950. Of course, Moshe Legani is the last mimer. We'll get to that shortly. But through these years, the Frierdiker Rebbe said these Mamorim, delivered them, and also wrote them. Now, what's unique to this is the last 10 years. When he came to America, you have to remember the Frierdiker Rebbe was not well physically. He had MS, he had been tortured, he suffered a stroke in the early 40s, so it became more difficult for him to speak. So we don't know exactly when, but approximately 1944, or probably 44, maybe 43. Excuse me. Frierdiker Rebbe stopped delivering Maimorim, and he only wrote them. Then later, he stopped even writing. And they began printing Maimorim that he had said in the 1920s or 1930s, mostly in the 20s. Like Basar Legani, for example, Tafshin Yud, famous Basar Legani, is the Frierdiker Rebbe's Maimer. But that was not said in 1950. It was said in 1923, actually. The Rebbe took that, meaning our Rebbe, and he was the publisher at the time. So he took the Maimorim from 1923, clearly, either by instructions of the Frierdiker Rebbe or with his agreement, and turned it into what we call the Hemshech Basar Legani. He didn't change anything. It's the exact Maimer from 1923. But in 1923, it wasn't Mefursim. It wasn't known. No one had it. So it was like a new Maimer. But it was not delivered in 1950. So basically, the Maimorim, I would say at least from 1945, 46, 47 and on, were not delivered. Many of them were not even written then. They were written earlier. But they're still for Frierdiker Rebbe's Maimorim. So you will find duplicates of Maimorim in the early 20s that you find later in the late 40s. Sometimes with a different beginning, but the actual Maimer is almost word for word. And this is the Frierdiker Rebbe's output in Maimorim wise. Now, Sfarim wise, you have from the Frierdiker Rebbe also Kuntresim. There's a Kuntres Limud Achsidus and a Kuntres Teres Achsidus. 2 Kuntresim, similar to the Rebbe Rashab, like 2 journals or essays, one on Teres Achsidus and one on Limud Achsidus. And there are other, are there other Kuntresim from the Frierdiker Rebbe? I'll just make mention of this, that some of the Maimorim of the Frierdiker Rebbe were published in a set called Sefer HaKuntresim, which first 2 volumes and then later 3 volumes. These are select Maimorim, mostly from the 30s, from the 1930s, the tzaddiks, that was selected, but they're not in order of, they're not like a whole year. They're just selected Maimorim that the Rebbe gave out weekly by Shabbos. They put it on the tables, a weekly kuntus, a weekly a publication was put out with a Maimer, with a Sicha, with a letter maybe, and they were then put into Sefer Maimorim Kuntresim. But today, everything has been printed in the order of the years, again, from 1920 through 1950. Then there's, of course, Igris Kedesh, many. Frierdiker Rebbe's Igris is now 30 volumes at least, I think. 28 volumes, a lot of volumes. I may be mistaken, maybe less. But it's a big set of letters that the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote over these years. Keep in mind, the Frierdiker Rebbe also said Maimorim because he traveled. There are Maimorim that he said in Israel when he was there in 1929, 1930. His Maimorim he said in America in 1930. And in addition, of course, to the different cities that he visited throughout in Europe and other places. So that is the output of the Frierdiker Rebbe. What I didn't discuss is the method of the Frierdiker Rebbe, which that I'll reserve for tomorrow, because I don't want to rush it. But I'll stop here, and with that, I will stop if anybody wants to ask anything, and then we'll sign off.
Rabbi, did we also attribute the Kutei Deburim, the stories, to that the Frierdiker
no,
Rebbe
that's good.
collected?
I'm glad you mentioned it. The Kutei Deburim are the sichos of the Frierdiker Rebbe. He spoke a lot more than we have from the Rebbe Rashab, the Frierdiker Rebbe speaking, and He himself published Likutei Diburim, first in Kontresim, again, in individual pamphlets, but he wrote a lot of it as well. Frierdiker Rebbe wrote some of his own talks, and we have those manuscripts. So Likutei Diburim is 2 volumes. It's actually 4 volumes, but 2 in each volume. We have 2 books, 4 sections, and that's Likutei Diburim. I forgot to mention Likutei Diburim. That's correct. So Likutei Diburim are sichos, the talks of the Frierdiker Rebbe, which, like, was by Farbrengen. He would talk, but then there was a mimer. So the Maimorim are a different set, and the Likutei Diburim is another set. And many of these Kontresim, the Rebbe also published sichos of the Frierdiker Rebbe. I should have mentioned that. Talks that the Frierdiker Rebbe delivered in different times. Talks he delivered, by the way, all the way through 1950. We have the Frierdiker Rebbe talks on after Yom Kippur, 1950, Sukkot, and so on. So talks he continued to speak, even though his speech was slurred because of the stroke that he suffered, but he did speak all the way. But Maimorim, he stopped saying earlier. So I should have mentioned that. I'm sorry I didn't mention that. Right. Yeah. I have to just remind myself there's other things that he published. Because the Frierdiker Rebbe definitely published stuff. But you know what? I'll reserve it all for tomorrow in case anything I missed. Any other questions, comments? Okay. Good. So it looks like we're going to be probably finish this series of overview maybe tomorrow or latest Sunday. But and then we'll resume from there. Okay. Everyone have very. I'm going to sign off here. Let's stop here. So we covered today Rebbe Maharash, Rebbe Rashab, and most of the Frierdiker Rebbe. We still have to finish the Frierdiker Rebbe, and we'll do the rest in the next class or 2.